Hi everybody, welcome to our next lesson on Kennedy and Foreign Affairs for April 4th, 2018. So we have some objectives and standards here. We have our objectives: explain President Kennedy's foreign policy and identify world conflicts that arose during the Kennedy years. And please take a look at the standards too if you would. So our desired result: how did the Kennedy administration handle various conflicts around the globe? Okay, so responding to threats. So President Kennedy believed that Eisenhower, with his administration, had not done enough to stop the spread of communism. He also believed that the current policies of mutual destruction in terms of small conflicts was not working. So if you remember that President Eisenhower kind of had this mutually assured destruction theory where, if the Soviet Union was going to do something, that we were going to attack back, and it was just going to result in pretty much nuclear war. So, remember we talked about brinksmanship and living on the edge of not knowing whether or not a nuclear bomb was going to, or a nuclear missile was going to come at any second. So Kennedy wanted a policy of what we call flexible response. This is what his administrators called it as well. And what this was he boosted non-nuclear options in terms for the military. So the policy basically increased funding for troops, ships, and artillery, and also created the elite branch of the Army known as the Special Forces or Green Berets. So Kennedy is trying to move away from, just nuclear missiles and nuclear weapons and trying to move more towards a traditional sense of military force to try and combat communism around the world. So before President Kennedy came into office, Eisenhower had broken ties with Cuba. In the late 1950s, Fidel Castro, or I should say mid-1950s, Fidel Castro, a communist revolutionary, seized control of the tiny island country. Okay. Now Castro had promised democracy and promised changes for the country, but soon started to run the country like a dictator. And actually, Fidel Castro just passed away, I believe, this past December, and was somewhat in control of the country, although with his age he had kind of stepped back a little bit. But either way, Castro had been in charge of Cuba since like the 1950s up until very recently. Once Castro has expressed, support for communism, and he gets the support of the Soviet Union, many Cubans began to flee to the U.S., mainly Miami, Florida, since Cuba is very close to Florida. Many Cubans began to flee there for safety and look for some type of, protection from, Fidel Castro and, this new type of government. Now, prior to Kennedy coming into office, Eisenhower had authorized the CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency, to train Cuban exiles, so people who had fled Cuba, to invade Cuba in an attempt to overthrow Castro. Now, Kennedy learned of the plan a few days after becoming president. He is concerned over the plan, but he does approve it to happen. Again, they hope that this plan would help a mass rising against Castro, and they could take Cuba back from, the communist. So on April 17th, 1961, Cuban exiles supported by the U.S. military landed at night at, I'm going to mess up my Spanish here, Bahia de Cochinos, or what we know as the Bay of Pigs. Okay, so they land at this small little part of the island. Now, the invasion immediately went wrong from the beginning. There was supposed to be an airstrike that did not knock out the Cuban Air Forces like it was supposed to. There was supposed to be a smaller distraction group to distract the Cuban and Soviet forces that never arrived on the island. And there was just overall a lack of American military support for the operation. So in the long run, the Bay of Pigs invasion and this plan to overthrow Castro is a failure. Now, many Cuban exiles were either captured or killed. President Kennedy will take blame for the operation, although He's obviously very angry with the military and the CIA, saying like, how come this didn't go as planned? Like, this was supposed to be, taken care of. So he does take the blame publicly for it. And this is a pretty embarrassing start for President Kennedy in terms of foreign affairs, since he's only been in office a few months as president. So this was a pretty embarrassing event for him. He also had to negotiate for the release of the remaining prisoners with Castro, which Castro does do, but again, a pretty embarrassing start for foreign affairs for the Kennedy administration. All right, so Berlin in trouble. So also in 1961, many East Berliners were fleeing to West Berlin and reporting on the poor economic conditions of that side of the country. So remember that Germany had been divided up after World War II, and the section that the Soviets controlled, well, it wasn't as successful or economical as say West Berlin. So many people in East Berlin are fleeing to West Berlin, and they're taking their money and resources with them when they left. And again, they're reporting saying, hey, you know what, East Berlin, it stinks over there. We want to stay here. So to solve this problem, Khrushchev threatened to sign a treaty with East Germany and close all access roads to West Germany. So he doesn't want people from East Germany or East Berlin leaving and going to West Germany or West Berlin. Kennedy obviously refuses this, and a confrontation is going to begin between, again, Kennedy and Khrushchev. So the determination of President Kennedy and America's military strength prevented the Soviets' attempt to block off access to West Germany and West Berlin. However, on the night of August 13th, 1961, East Berlin soldiers began rolling out construction of the Berlin Wall. You may have heard of this before. Within a few days, there's this big, high cement wall, brick wall, dividing West Berlin and East Berlin. It has barbed wires. It has soldiers. It's just a very dangerous situation. And this, like you said, this is going to divide West and East Berlin. And the Berlin Wall will remain standing until, I believe, 1989. And many people did try to flee, over this wall or under this wall, whatever the case may be. And many people died while trying to do this. And the Berlin Wall kind of became a symbol of, this divide between, democracy and communism. It became a symbol of this physical divide between America and the Soviet Union. All right. So the Soviet Union was also a strong ally of Cuba. We just talked about Cuba a couple slides ago. So the Soviet Union was a strong ally of the island nation. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, he's in charge of the Soviet Union at this time, had promised to defend the nation of Cuba. In the summer of 1962, Cuba began receiving supplies of weapons, including nuclear missiles from the Soviets. Now, President Kennedy issues a warning saying, listen, I'm not happy with this, but, they're kind of hesitant. Again, that flexible response, they're kind of hesitant to take any type of action. On October 14th, 1962, American Air Forces captured photos of Soviet bases on Cuba with missiles ready to launch, okay? These missiles could reach American cities in minutes, within, 15 to, 20 minutes, even less than that. Nuclear missiles could be reaching Washington, D.C., New York City, Atlanta, Texas, many different key cities. Of course, obviously, the two big ones being Washington, D.C. and New York City on the East Coast. But, think about where we live today, too, where many of you live, too. I mean, many of these missiles could have reached cities where you may be located, like Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or things like that, and could have caused widespread destruction as well. On October 22nd, 1962, Kennedy makes a national televised address to the nation and warns that an attack on the U.S. would trigger an all-out war with the Soviet Union. So Kennedy says, listen, you know what? If they do fire nuclear missiles at our cities, we will not hesitate to respond and fire nuclear missiles back. So again, coming to, this brinkmanship, this, people, this edge of war type thing. So for the next 6 days, the world watched and waited in fear. Of course, obviously, Americans and the Soviets being the two biggest people who are going to watch and wait in fear, whether or not they don't know if they're going to look outside their window the next day and see a nuclear bomb, a nuclear mushroom cloud, going off. Soviet ships were also, which were supposed to be carrying more weapons to Cuba, were facing a quarantine by American ships. So American ships lined up outside the island of Cuba and would not allow Soviet ships to come near the island. And also there were troops stationed in Florida waiting for possible directions for a possible invasion of Cuba if something like this were going to happen. So again, people around the world are waiting and wondering if destruction is imminent. So in the long run, there are some talks between, the Soviets and the Americans. And Soviet ships are going to stop in their travel to avoid a confrontation with these American ships outside of Cuba. Khrushchev kind of backs down. He agrees to remove the missiles from Cuba if the U.S. would not invade the tiny island. The Americans agreed. Also, secretly, the United States agreed to remove missiles from Turkey, nuclear missiles from Turkey, which were, these missiles that were in Turkey pointed at the Soviet Union. So both sides got the removal of missiles. So nuclear war had been avoided. And I'm sorry, this becomes known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. So even though Kennedy and Khrushchev had many heated confrontations in the 1960s, they both also wanted to resolve any future issues. So in 1963, President Kennedy announced that a hotline, or a phone, had been established between the two leaders, and this phone would allow for both Kennedy and Khrushchev to pick up that phone and communicate with each other directly if another crisis like the Cuban Missile Crisis or the issue in Berlin or the Bay of Pigs invasion happened again. That way they could speak directly and try and solve the issue and resolve the issue before it became too heated. And another, not side note, but another note here is that they both did agree to a limited test ban treaty that banned the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. So again, it wasn't just always confrontation and heated arguments. There was some agreements between Kennedy and Khrushchev. And our closure. How did the Kennedy administration handle various conflicts around the globe? Think about some of the things we just discussed, different conflicts around the world, and that President Kennedy and his administration were dealing with, and that'll help you answer the question. All right, buddy, have a great rest of your day or night. Talk to you soon.